Pay attention, please. Let's be quiet. You know it's difficult, but I need you to focus on this up here right now. Thank you. Okay, so I showed you guys a map before of the different biomes. I made the point of saying that latitude is not it is a factor in where these biomes occur, but there are some variations, particularly with ocean currents and mountain ranges and things like that. But one thing that latitude does influence is the amount of precipitation. And hopefully you guys remember way back when we talked about the atmosphere and the fact that you have what we call convection cell currents, where it rises at the equator because of course that gets the most heat, and then the air moves towards the poles and then cools down because it's in the upper atmosphere and sinks back down at the 30-degree parallel. Anybody remember that? Vaguely, maybe? Okay, so here's the thing. Where it rises there at the equator, 0-degree parallel, that rising air means lower pressure. Low pressure makes water evaporate more evaporation, more precipitation. So you get a considerable amount of rainfall in that particular area along the equatorial region, of course. And then where it comes down, the opposite is going to happen. So when it descends at the 30-degree parallel, that means it's going to cause increased pressure. It's a high pressure zone in those areas. Higher pressure, less evaporation, less precipitation. That's where we find many of our deserts is along the 30-degree parallel. That will then repeat itself. It turns it like a gear, if you remember. And that will cause at the 60-degree parallel another low pressure area. So now you're not going to get nearly as much precipitation there as you did down here at the equator, of course, because it's much colder. So this is up in your northern Canada, Siberia kind of area. But what you do get is you get a considerable amount of snowfall. Snowfall is precipitation. On the other hand, where you go down, where it descends at the poles is very dry. And those areas near the poles and the tundra and things like that, they actually have the same level of precipitation, the tundra and the deserts. So, so they do, the parallels do have an influence on precipitation, but of course there's many other factors that influence precipitation. Like I said, ocean currents, mountain ranges, things like that. So we do see some of them spread out, but it's important to understand that your precipitation is your primary thing. The amount of precipitation is the primary thing that's going to determine what kind of biome you have. Okay, so we'll go down the list from the lowest to the highest as far as precipitation goes. Your deserts, of course, lowest amount of precipitation, and for reasons I just explained. But of course, some deserts are formed because of mountain ranges and the rain can't get past them. Tundra, same thing, but I mean, and they're not. The tundra is in the northern latitudes. You could have it in the southern latitudes, but there's just simply very little landmass down there. So we see these primarily just below the Arctic Circle. And although they get very little precipitation, it would of course be snowfall there, they have kind of a storehouse, because that little bit that does fall and melt and soak down into the ground, then when the winter comes it freezes, so they have a permanent layer of ice down there. So also in the summer, the very short summer that they have, that water does melt and forms kind of like swampy areas, and therefore consequently you do have more water available. Even though the amount of precipitation is about the same, but you have more water available and therefore a little bit more productivity in the tundra than you do in the desert. Then that moves us along to grasslands. They are typically in your 45-degree parallel, stuff like that, kind of in between these different zones. They have a moderate amount of rainfall. The closer they are to the equator, the more rainfall they have. So for example, we have what's called prairies as a grassland here in North America that don't have nearly as much rainfall as the savanna type grasslands that you find in Africa and South America. But grasses can survive on this much, however trees cannot for the most part, and so that gives us that typical type of ecosystem there with your grasslands. At the 60-degree parallel, remember I said that they get a fair amount of precipitation. Of course, it's in the form of snow. This is where we find that gives enough water, because that snow, of course, will melt, to nourish trees, coniferous trees in that area. Also, that snow forms a blanket, an insulating blanket on the ground so that the ground doesn't freeze up like you do with the tundra. That's another thing that limits trees in the tundra, is you got that permafrost and the trees can't take root deep in the ground, so you're not gonna get trees there. Then we go to deciduous forest. These a lot of times are around the same latitudes, but for one reason or another they're getting more rain. A lot of times mountain ranges have an effect in these areas. So they get a pretty fair amount of it, up to 150 centimeters a year during the summer typically, and consequently it's enough to support not just some trees, but it's also support broadleaf trees. Broadleaf trees need a lot of water. And so we find that there, and they may take advantage of that rainfall and the amount of sunlight they get during the summer that way. And then they have, as we'll talk about in a minute, adaptations for when the winter comes. And then, of course, you finally get your rainforest. So very high amounts of water, rainfall every year, over 200 centimeters a year. Some areas, I believe Hawaii actually, and Hawaii, by the way, is in the tropics. I believe Hawaii actually has one of the rainiest spots in the world where they get like 400 centimeters a year. So that's very, very wet area. Of course, you got all that ocean surrounding it, so that contributes to it as well. Soil. So soil is factors in soil are determined once again also by precipitation. That has a big impact on soil, as well as the type of vegetation that's living in that biome. So, for example, with the desert, that soil actually has a high mineral content. It's actually very fertile soil. Not a lot of low organic content because there's not a lot of plants living there. But it has that high mineral content because there's not a lot of rain. Rain washes out minerals. So they have had instances like in California and in the Middle East where they have either made wells or they've diverted water into the desert areas and actually produced pretty productive crops in those areas. Then your tundra, like I said, major feature, permafrost in there, relatively low organic content, very short growing season. It has stuff, it has plants and everything, but not a whole lot, and they don't get very big. So you're not going to have a lot of organic content in the soil there because of that. Then you got your grasslands. Now grasslands have very thick topsoil, and that is because of the way grasslands grow. Grasses grow. Grasses, as you know, grow like in mats, so they shoot out runners and stuff. But then they die every year and come back. And then when they come back, the next season, the new layer grows on top of the old layer. So you get this layering over the years where you can get very deep topsoil, sometimes up to 6 feet deep. Because of that, and because the majority of the calories, the majority of the food in the world is grains, and grains are grasses, these areas have been highly exploited for agriculture over the millennia. All right, then we go to the taiga. The taiga does have a moderate topsoil. This is mainly contributed from the needles that drops off the trees. And then another factor of that soil, property of it, is that it tends to be acidic because needles, pine needles and spruce and all those kind of coniferous type needles are high in sugar content because that helps keep them from freezing. But consequently, when the bacteria break down that, they produce a lot of acids when they do so. So that gives them acidic soil, which can be a limiting factor for a number of different types of plants and stuff that live there. Of course, the ones that are there are actually adapted to it and prefer that type of soil. Then you got your deciduous forest. Now, hopefully you know or understand the deciduous trees, they do drop their leaves in the fall. And consequently, they've got a fair amount of topsoil from that. And the big factor of that is the contribution from all the leaf litter. Not only that, it's going to take a while for those leaves and stuff to decompose, particularly since you're going in the winter. So in the meantime, they call that overlay because it's not technically considered part of the soil. In the meantime, that produces a lot of habitat, a lot of food for a number of different organisms. It also provides an area for organisms to hibernate, particularly reptiles and snakes and stuff. Not that they have that many in these colder areas, but if you're wandering around in the woods of Appalachia during the fall, I don't suggest kicking through the leaves and stuff if you're out in the forest and things. It's a good home for copperheads. And then finally, the rainforest. Now, a lot of people assume the rainforest has got so much growth, it's got to have rich soil. It does not. Actually, all that stuff is in all that massive amount of growth that's there. You also have lots of rain, and remember I just said the rain washes the minerals out. So rainforest soil is actually quite poor. It also has very rapid decomposition, which doesn't leave anything in the soil for very long, as well as all the plants and everything. They absorb all the stuff out of the soil. So when they clear rainforests, it does not make for good agricultural lands, which is a good thing when you consider it, because it preserves them a little bit. So let's go ahead and look at any questions about the soil? Okay, kind of know a little bit about each one of the things. I tried to put a little bit of difference in each one of them, so understand that and the reasons why they're different. In the desert, of course, you got what they call succulents. These are plants that are adapted to very low amounts of rain. And we're talking about, we're not talking about, by the way, in the desert, we're talking the places like the Sahara or the Saudi desert, where they're big sand deserts that have very little productivity at all. We're talking about the ones like you see in the westerns, where they got cactuses and sagebrush and all kinds of stuff all over the place. So they're relatively productive and biodiverse in those areas. Those plants are adapted to what you typically get in those kind of deserts, which is maybe once or twice a year, a deluge of rainfall. You get a lot of rainfall. A lot of times it's because it finally makes it over the mountains, the clouds do, and when it comes down, it just pours. So they can store that up. You also have a lot of them that will mature and flower in a very short period of time, so they can take advantage of it. If you've never seen pictures of a desert in bloom, it's a pretty amazing sight. Then we go to your tundra. Like I said, it does have the summer season where the ice melts somewhat, not all of it, but melts somewhat, makes it so there's water available for the mosses and things like that. These are small, with small leaves and stuff, so they're less susceptible to freezing and those kind of things. And then, of course, the grasslands, grasses. You may notice here that you kind of can associate your different biomes with the kind of primary producers that you find in those areas. Grasses can survive with low amounts of water. They tend to die back in the very driest parts of the year and then grow again the next year. They're annual plants for the most part. Then you got your coniferous trees there. Some of the adaptations, of course, the needles will not be able to freeze as much. And another thing is the shape. We see that with coniferous trees, they tend to have this triangular shape. That's there for the snow to be shed from the branches, so it doesn't all pile up on the top of it. Now, this will be a very good representation, looks kind of like a snow cone, but this will be kind of a shape for a deciduous or broadleaf type tree. What would happen if all that snow piled up on the top of that tree?
Oh, it all just fall down.
It would knock it right over. Very good. Snow's heavy. Even though it's a little lighter than water, it's still heavy. Water is very dense. Snow is fairly dense as well. It would knock that tree right over, which is also why the deciduous trees drop their leaves. Not only do they not need them anymore, and therefore they're saving energy by dropping those leaves, also they would be a liability if they're still on the tree and got piled up with snow. You may notice, by the way, that is a forcible action when these leaves, you can actually hear little pops and everything during the fall in these areas. If you cut down a tree branch here, look at how long the leaves stay on there. They'll stay on there sometimes over a year, depending upon the species and how much fiber and things are in there. You can't do that with, as I just mentioned, and have dead leaves still up there because it's going to catch that snow and it's going to get toppled over. So they actually forcibly pop the leaves off of their branches and stuff and get rid of them. Okay. And then, of course, in the rainforest, you've got abundance of water and sunlight. Therefore, it's all a competition about who can get the most sunlight. You're going to have broadleaf trees because of that. They're perennial, which means, of course, they live all year round because you obviously don't have snow and cold and things like that to cause them to go dormant or die back. So that's what we see there. And then finally with the animals, you see a number of these. The animals are adapted both to the physical environment as well as the producers that they're consuming. Reptiles are particularly adept at holding in water and not getting dehydrated. I will say this, you do have polar deserts. Antarctica is considered a desert. You're not going to find any reptiles in Antarctica. So this is in hot areas. Same thing with burrowing animals. You're not going to find prairie dogs also in Antarctica. But the burrowing is a strategy for two things really: to avoid the elements. You guys need to get off your phones, put them away, please. To avoid the temperature extremes and things like that, but also to avoid predators. And you don't have that much cover in the desert, so that's an important thing. Then we look at our tundra. You do have grazers there that will come out and take advantage of the mosses and the grasses, things like that. One of the things you see, it doesn't have any trees, so there's no cover. So the adaptation that these grazers have is they tend to get big. That not only because they've got plenty of food so they can do that, but also it's a defensive thing. You've got no cover or anything like that. They're going to either be big like bison or water buffalo, or they're going to be fast like gazelles or zebras or antelope. Interestingly enough, you get a lot of mosquitoes and biting flies in these areas. This is because you get that swampy kind of area when the permafrost thaws, and you got plenty of these guys around for them to get a blood meal on to feed their eggs before they will then have them lay the eggs and die so the next generation can come along. Okay, same thing with grasslands, very similar. As a matter of fact, some ecologists classify tundra as a grassland, but same thing, grazers, burrows, so you could also put your large carnivores in there, lions and pumas and things like that that are going to prey upon wolves, that are going to prey out on these big animals and things like that. We get into the taiga. It's cold, so as you might imagine, there's strategies for coping with that cold through the year by hibernating or migrating. Sometimes just going into a different kind of metabolism mode. They do that. Same is true with your deciduous forests where they get cold in particular. And then finally, in the rainforest, a lot of trees, a lot of vegetation, a lot of it is edible, a lot of insects eating those trees and their products. So we find a huge number of species of insects in the rainforest, and arboreal species, which means species of trees like monkeys and lots of birds and things like that.
Good afternoon, announcements here.
That's it.
Staff, thank you again for